Persona 5 is officially 5 years old. It released back in Japan on September 15th, 2016. While it would later release on April 4th, 2017 in the West, I always remember this date as a really special one just because the wait for it was so interesting, and the lead up to its release in Japan was kind of interesting because it really was a culmination of years of anticipation, and it felt like the new beginning of a chapter for Atlus. And I wanted to make this video not only to kind of talk about the history of Persona 5 after its release, but just to kind of give this as a nice little recap for everyone who might have hopped on with Royal, or just might be curious about what's really happened to this game after its release. So I will not be going over my personal opinions. I've talked about Persona 5 a whole bunch. This video is mostly just to talk about the release of Persona 5 and everything that's happened over the last 5 years. So we're not going to get into the development history, we're not going to get into any drama and stuff like that, just taking a nice stroll down memory lane for a 5th anniversary. So, like I previously said, the game came out on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 3 on September 15th, 2016. This was the Japanese-only release date, and was really interesting because there was really a multimedia campaign release at the time. It was right around 3 major events kind of happening, especially in the Japanese market. Obviously, the first 2 are not as big of a deal for a lot of people, but the first one was the Persona 5 OVA, the Daybreakers, released. The Daybreakers released actually worldwide, thankfully, and was a nice taste of what the Persona 5 kind of game world and theme might feel like. And also releasing in the same month was the Persona 5 manga. The Persona 5 manga is a really interesting case because the manga is still ongoing to this day. Even after 5 years, in Japan and in the West, it is still ongoing, and I cannot recommend both enough personally. The Daybreakers is a really nice slice of life, doesn't really fit into a certain kind of thing for spoilers, so it's perfect for anyone, whether it be your first time checking it out or your 10th time checking it out. And another really interesting thing about Persona 5's release is that it was tied very heavily into Sony marketing with the PlayStation price cut along with the PlayStation 4 Slim. So the PlayStation 4 Slim released a couple of months before the PlayStation 4 Pro in 2016. And while most people don't really think of the Slim very often, it's always associated itself with Persona 5 in my brain with the Japanese release because there was this huge marketing push of Persona 5 stealing the hearts of people who want to play PlayStation 4 and just can't afford it because I think it was like $150 more or something like that. But it was just this really intricate ad campaign. They had a whole song about it. It's very, very interesting. I highly recommend checking out the full thing yourself. But yeah, Sony really had a big marketing push into it of like, hey, we're lining this game up. It's right at the time of our Slim console, so everyone can pick it up. This is not like a game that needs to be on the Pro anyway. So we're now releasing a cheaper version of one of our most popular systems with one of the most anticipated JRPGs of the year. Really perfect synergy, and I think it was one of those interesting kind of moments of like, yeah, it makes sense. So going back to the release of the game itself in Japan, the game was a really, really big hit. Obviously not selling as much on PlayStation 3 as it did on PlayStation 4, but I think that was part of the reason Atlus transitioned over focus to PS4 and not just PS3, because they were aware the world was quickly moving on from the PlayStation 3 a lot more than a lot of companies expected at the time. So the game on both platforms sold over 250,000 at release, and even went on to sell now over 3 million copies. Numbers get a little bit iffy just because there's kind of that breakdown between Persona 3 in the West selling millions, whereas in Japan it really only sold a little over 250,000. But even at the time, it definitely charted. It had a lot of buzz, had a lot of good hype, had a lot of good reviews. So there was a lot of good energy leading over the next couple of months from the Japanese release to the American release. So the American release and the rest of the West got the game on April 4th, 2017. And that was a really interesting case because there had been so many delays even after the Japanese release of people just kind of not being sure what was going on. Like, was this going to actually finally come out? And thankfully, yes, it came out. And had an interesting release timing because it was in a weird spot of releasing after the Nintendo Switch, but was a PlayStation exclusive. So there was that era, if anyone will remember, when the Switch was out, people were like, I kind of want to play it on my Switch. Like, people were dropping games like Horizon Zero Dawn because it's like, well, Breath of the Wild's on here. So Persona definitely helped itself by giving it that, like, month of cushion. But it still is an endless battle to this day of people looking at titles like Persona 5 and being like, I just wish I could play it portably. So I think it releasing a month after the Switch is definitely part of that cause, but that's a laundry list of issues we will not be getting into. So it came out in the West, and like I said, it was definitely the major selling market of selling millions and millions of copies, and has now pushed it to being the best one in the entire series, at now over 3 million copies, and I would not be surprised if it even gets bumped up to 3.5. It's just one of those kind of evergreen titles, especially now, looking upon it, it is now a PlayStation Hits in the West. It's always in best of collections, always in tons of sales. It's given away for free to PlayStation 5 owners. It's just one of those things that is very, very easy to either recommend or see just cheap enough that someone might pick it up and add another unit of sales to it years and years after its release. Now, interesting enough, there was actually kind of like a year of nothing really major coming out of Atlus after Persona 5. Now, obviously, there was tons of merch, and there were tons of other things releasing in terms of like licensing deals, but if I wanted to talk all about everything Persona 5 related merchandise-wise and licensing-wise, we would be here all day. So, for all of your time, let's just pretend that from the Western release in 2017 to 2018, it was very quiet. Everyone played the game, and you either loved it or you loved to talk about it. Our next major release or kind of milestone in the Persona 5 lifetime was in April of 2018 with the release of Persona 5 the Animation. Now, you would think this is going to be a slam dunk. It's Persona 5. Atlus has done anime adaptations before, but I will not be getting into it too well. But let's just say the legacy of Persona 5's anime is really sloppy and really expensive. Whether it be releasing in the West like it did in 2020 or whatnot, it's one of those things that I'm sure it has its fans, but it is definitely very low on the totem pole of people enjoying it, let alone remembering it. But yes, April of 2018 is when the show started releasing in Japan. Now, a whole month later, Atlus released Persona 3, and more importantly, Persona 5 Dancing in Starlight, or otherwise known in Japan as Dancing Star Night. Just for time, I will be calling it Persona 5 Dancing, just so we're not here listening to me say different names in different regions all the time. So, Persona 5 Dancing was made by the Persona 4 Dancing team and simultaneously released with Persona 3 Dancing. Now, you would think, okay, Persona 4 Dancing was a big hit, and everyone's going to love it. Unfortunately, it kind of stretched the team a bit too thin, and was one of those ones of it not only underperformed in terms of critics, but also underperformed in terms of sales majorly, and very, very quickly was going into clearance bins on PlayStation 4 and PlayStation Vita when the game released in Japan on May 24th, 2018. Now, Persona 5 Dancing was actually a pretty short time from its Japanese release to the Western one, but that wasn't always the case. The game was announced a month later in June of 2018 at E3 2018 for the West. It was going to come out in early 2019, and everyone was very perplexed by this, because obviously we knew Persona 5 Dancing was coming out to the West. We just didn't understand why this game with almost no story mode and very little content was taking so long to release. And hilariously, that ended up being one of the reasons why it got pushed up a release date. So the Western release ended up happening on December 4th, 2018. Same kind of story with Japan. Came out, it has its fans, sold very poorly, reviewed very middlingly, and it's just one of those things of the history of it was coming off of such a high with Persona 5, it definitely sort of knocked it down a few pegs of like, okay, this was definitely just kind of a cash-in or something that could have needed a little more TLC or time in the oven. Now, December 2018 was actually a really big month for Atlus and especially Nintendo. Now, these two hadn't really collaborated all too much, but this year was very special because 2018 marked the Game Awards of 2018, obviously, but more importantly, the very first ever character reveal for the first DLC character in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And Jeff Keighley dropped everybody's jaws in the world. I will never forget watching this in my basement, and everyone collectively losing their minds at Joker was coming to Smash Ultimate as the first DLC character. Again, sorry, Piranha Plant. So, being the first paid DLC character in a fighting game is normally a cool thing, but I think being the first character in this new Switch Smash Brothers is kind of on a upper echelon that other games just can't really get to, unless you're something like a Mortal Kombat almost. But yes, being a big third-party character, mostly known for Sony, coming to a Nintendo fighting game was a big deal. Now, while Joker was revealed in December of 2018, he ended up releasing in April 17th, 2019. So the wait wasn't too long, and Nintendo definitely did a good job of letting everyone know, hey, here's when he's coming, we're going to take some time, show it off a little bit more, hope you enjoy the character. And the character was such a great addition to the game that it almost kind of like restarted the lifeline of Persona 5 hype again. After 2018 definitely kind of was loss after loss of the anime and the dancing game. Not a lot of love for the series coming off of Persona 5 in 2017 or 16. So Smash Brothers definitely did that series a lot of good in the meantime just by adding a DLC character, which again might sound like a crazy thing for it, but Super Smash Brothers is the most popular and best-selling fighting game of all time. And Ultimate, having your DLC character is just kind of that extra push in the limelight you might need to give yourself that second chance. Not like a multi-million selling game needed a second chance, but it had one nonetheless because of it. Now, taking a tiny step back and a little bit of a step forward, we're going to talk about Persona Q2 New Cinema Labyrinth. Now, if anyone out there has played, the Persona Q games are made at Atlus and heavily influenced and worked on by a lot of the Etrian Odyssey teams. The first Persona Q released a couple years back on the 3DS, and Persona Q2 was no different. Releasing on the 3DS and also now featuring characters not only from Persona 3 and 4, but heavily using the cast of Persona 5. Now, this release was kind of interesting because, much like I said with Persona 5, in a post-Switch world of 2017, a game not being on the Switch was very weird. In a post-Switch world in 2018 for Japan and 2019 in the West was extra weird. Now, the game came out on November 29th, 2018 in Japan, and in the West it released on June 4th, 2019. Now, this is again kind of a weird similar case to Persona 5 Dancing, but not in terms of its reception. The game got reviewed very favorably. Said it had a lot of improvements over the original, mostly the score, the visual style, everything looked great, it played great. It was just had that caveat of it's a 3DS game, so time to dust off that 3DS, and I hope you enjoy playing it. Unfortunately, Japan, and to a much higher extent America, did not feel like dusting off their 3DS and led to this being one of the worst-selling Persona titles of all time. Which is really funny because you think of how many copies the first Persona Q sold, on top of the fact that at this point, in 2019 even, there are millions of 3DSs just out there, and this was one of the last big releases for the system, and just people either didn't really care, or just wanted to play it somewhere else, or just wanted to play other things. So, sadly, Persona Q2, again, kind of lost to history, not because of its quality, but just because of its release timing and its strategy and everything that kind of went into it. So, I always feel extra bad for that team in terms of the product they put out didn't suffer because of anything that they had any control of. It was just the world they put it out in was a little bit too late, and hopefully that game gets its time to shine, but we're still not at the Persona Q HD Collection days just yet. Now, in 2019 though, Atlus did announce two new Persona projects. One was releasing that year, and one was releasing in the next year. The first one was Persona 5 The Royal. Persona 5 The Royal was expected, but I think still surprised a lot of people in the sense that it was Persona 5 again, now only on PlayStation 4, and was introducing new elements, gameplay changes, characters, and a lot of features people either maybe wanted or were going to be surprised about. So, Persona 5 Royal was announced and released in Japan on October 31st, 2019, and released on March 31st, 2020, but the Royal was really interesting for a case of, these are two separate games. You couldn't just transfer your stuff and experience the new post-game content. No, this was something you had to start over fresh, check it out and experience like that. And even though I feel like that's still kind of a hard sell to some people in some aspects, even though over 3 million people at that point had played Persona 5, the Royal sold very, very well, not only in Japan, but especially in the West, boosting the series over the 4 million mark. Now, the Royal especially was interesting for its sales reasons in the West, because as a lot of you know, it came out right at the start of the pandemic, and the quarantine definitely was a big factor of word of mouth. People were highly, highly praising this game. A lot of reviews were in the tens, and aspects like that were just like, hey, if you're trapped inside, just pick up this game. It's like a 100-hour game if you want. Enjoy it, play it, love it. And it was just that easy sort of recommendation that I think maybe in a more normal release calendar without the pandemic kind of looming over it, might not have spread around so easily. There were times of it being sold out for the first month or so of release, which is very, very rare for an Atlus game. Now, Persona 5 finally selling over 4 million copies with the help of Persona 5 Royal was a really, really big sign and kind of solidifying the fact that, like, okay, hey, we stumbled a little bit at first, but we've got a little bit more going on, and we can hopefully salvage this and try and keep it going, make more games, make more properties. Now, next up we have kind of a weird one where we're talking about one game, but with two very different titles. Now, in February 2020, Atlus released Persona 5 Scramble, The Phantom Strikers. Now, in February of 2021, Atlus West released Persona 5 Strikers, not only on PlayStation 4 this time, but also on Nintendo Switch, and finally on PC. So Persona 5 Strikers was a really interesting case, not only with its development because Atlus worked on it, obviously, and helped produce and publish the title, but this was primarily developed via Koei Tecmo's Omega Force. Omega Force being known for making things like Dynasty Warriors, Samurai Warriors, but have worked on things like Berserk, Attack on Titan, and was a real big effort for that team to work on it for over 3 years, and being an interesting case of it doesn't play like Persona 5, but it has a lot of elements like Persona 5. It takes place after the events of Persona 5, so it's almost like a sequel to a lot of people in those ways. So taking that story, evolving it further, adding new characters, adding new casts, adding new context and continuity to everything, expanding that world, and the bigger scope of it not only feeling like much more of a sequel, even if it's not a traditional sequel, helped it kind of wipe away that stigma of, it's just a spin-off, or I don't really need to play it, it's just a spin-off, and has now solidified itself of reviewed very well in the West and in Japan, selling extremely well in Japan and extremely well in the West, now being the most profitable Persona non-mainline game of all time. It's one of the best-selling. It overtopped even Persona Q. It's over 500,000 copies now, which is insane for something that's not a mainline title. Which just kind of goes back to the fact that even though this is something completely different, it doesn't play like a normal Persona game, fans were still hungry, fans still wanted to experience more of this world, more of this cast, and there was still a lot of blood left in this series if it was handled right. You couldn't just pump something out. And now that leads us to September of 2021. So yes, we have no announced games that are planning on release. We have a couple of rumored things coming out. We're on the precipice of a lot of announcements from Atlus. We even have other little things kind of coming out. Obviously, crossovers are happening all the time. If I was listing all of the potential crossovers, we would be here even longer talking about things like Phantasy Star Online, Dragon's Dogma, Sonic Forces, Grand Blue Fantasy, Another Eden, and of course Tokyo Mirage Sessions, but we just don't have time for that. But shoutouts to other ones coming up because, I mean, I'd be remiss not to mention Super Monkey Ball Banana Mania, but hey, that's just DLC. Other things coming out people might be interested in, we've even got more manga coming out. The previously Japanese-only release of Persona 5 Mementos Mission is now coming out later in December through the West. More releases are coming, hopefully more ports are coming, a lot of questions, but this video isn't about questions. This video was just to walk you down memory lane and hopefully not be too sloppy about it. So, I hope you liked this. I hope you are at least a little bit more informed on the history of Persona 5 after its release over the last 5 years in Japan. Japan. Let me know in the comments below which one is your favorite. Let me know below which one you still need to get to. Do you have a least favorite? I want to hear all the stuff about Persona 5 in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching this. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel. If you subscribe to the channel, it really helps a lot. If you share the videos, it really helps a lot. If you support the Patreon, it really helps a lot. All those links are in the comments below. Happy anniversary, Persona 5. Have a good rest of your week, everybody, and I will see you later. Bye.